February 14th, 1992, four boys walking along a train track in Liverpool stumble upon what initially looked like a cat or a discarded doll. But as they approached, the chilling truth revealed itself. It was a lifeless body of a toddler, brutally mutilated. The toddler was James Bulger. The scene was nothing short of horrifying. James had been subjected to unimaginable violence, struck repeatedly with bricks and stones. A 22-pound iron bar had been dropped onto his small frame. The most appalling part of this crime was that his body had been placed on the train tracks, where an oncoming train tragically severed him in two. His lower half was found completely naked, bearing disturbing injuries to the groin area. But what was far worse than the crime itself were the murderers guilty for it. In a moment the British public could hardly comprehend, the police's investigation ultimately led to the arrest of 10-year-old best friends Robert Thompson and John Venables. This is a harrowing story of James Bulger and what drove his murderers to commit the unimaginable at such a young age. James Patrick Bulger was born on March 16, 1990, to Denise and Ralph Bulger in Merseyside, England. He was deeply loved by his parents. His mother Denise had a previous pregnancy that had tragically resulted in a miscarriage. This loss made her exceptionally protective of James, often keeping him by her side wherever she went. His mom called him the light of their lives. On Friday, February 12th, Denise accompanied her brother's girlfriend, Nicola, to the Strand shopping center. Denise brought along her 2-year-old son, James, who was full of boundless energy. They arrived at the mall at 2:30 p.m. While Nicola went to the store to exchange some clothes, Denise waited nearby with James. For a brief moment, James wandered out of her sight, giving her a scare, but she quickly spotted him again. By 4 p.m., Denise and James made their way to the final stop, a butcher shop. Holding James' hand, Denise entered the store, but as she momentarily released his hand to pay at the counter, she glanced down and realized, to her horror, that James was gone. Panic set in immediately. Denise alerted mall security, who began calling James' name over the intercom, while countless shoppers joined the search. Despite their efforts, by 4:15 p.m., James was still nowhere to be found, prompting the authorities to get involved. When the police reviewed the CCTV footage, they uncovered a chilling discovery. The camera showed James being led out of the mall by what appeared to be two teenage boys. Startlingly, it had taken them only 1 minute and 39 seconds to lure James away and leave the premises with him. At first, the officers believed it might have been a prank. After all, they were just kids. But what they would soon uncover was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Devastated, Denise made an emotional appeal for James' safe return on TV. Through tears, she pleaded, "Please, if you have my baby, just bring him home." She described her son with heartbreaking detail, sharing that he loved everything to do with trains and had been wearing a t-shirt featuring a train that day. Her plea tugged at the community's heart, but as the investigation unfolded, the tragic reality of what had happened would make her words all the more heartbreaking. 2 days later, on February 14th, Denise and Ralph's worst nightmare became a devastating reality. Young James' body would be discovered on the tracks in the grotesque condition. James had sustained 42 injuries, predominantly to his face and head, evidence of the harrowing abuse he endured. Authorities later confirmed that the 2-year-old had already been murdered before the train severed his waist. Still, he had been alive when his killers left him on the tracks. Police had work to do and quickly began their search. Who could inflict such unspeakable cruelty upon an innocent child? During their investigation, police quickly noticed that James had blue paint thrown into his face. This detail may seem small, but it quickly became one of the most crucial details in such a horrific case. Thankfully, being a shopping mall, CCTV footage was everywhere. Police acted quickly, grabbing a photograph of two boys holding James' hand and releasing it to the public. They pleaded that anyone with information on the identity of the two young boys come forward. A breakthrough came when a woman contacted the authorities. She revealed that her friend, Susan Venables, had a son, John, who had skipped school on that fateful Friday. Disturbingly, she mentioned that John had blue paint on the sleeve of his jacket and bore a striking resemblance to one of the boys in the footage. John's companion, Robert Thompson, had also been absent from school that day. On Thursday, February 18th, at 7:30 in the morning, 4 police officers arrived at Ann Thompson's home with a search warrant. When Robert descended the stairs, the officers were struck by his youth. He was, after all, just a child, not a teenager like they initially thought he would be. Upon realizing he was a suspect, Robert began to cry. The officers collected his clothing, quickly noticing bloodstains on his shoes. Meanwhile, at the Venables residence, Susan Venables answered the door with an almost eerie calmness. "I knew you'd be here," she said. "I told him you'd want to see him for skipping school on Friday." She even mentioned, seemingly unaware of its darker implications, that John had come home that day with his coat covered in blue paint. What Susan didn't realize was the horrifying truth about her son's actions. When the police requested John's coat, their suspicions deepened. Not only was it smeared with blue paint, but there was also a small, heartbreakingly distinct handprint on the sleeve. A handprint that belonged to a very young child. Overwhelmed, John clung to his mother, crying. He then shifted the blame to Robert, accusing him of always getting him into trouble. On the way to the police station, John appeared both terrified and morbidly curious about the entire process. He posed multiple questions and expressed concern about whether Robert had also been arrested. Both boys were subjected to blood, hair, and fingerprint analysis as the investigation intensified. Police were sure that they had their perpetrators, but the question remained: what could drive 2 young boys to commit such an unthinkable act? A question not so easily answered. To best answer this question, we must take a closer look at the events and circumstances that shaped them from the beginning. Robert Thompson was born on the 23rd of August, 1982. His home life was rough. His father was very abusive, both emotionally, physically, and sexually. He was one of 6 boys all brought up in horrible violence. His dad eventually deserted his family, causing his mom to turn to drinking. Robert was always skipping school and finding himself in trouble. He hung out with a bad group of kids and had been in trouble in the past for shoplifting. He, however, did not have a history of violence. John Venables, on the other hand, experienced a noticeably different upbringing. He grew up in a relatively stable home environment, free from the extreme trauma that Robert endured. However, his family faced their own challenges. John's parents were divorced, and he had siblings with special needs who required extra attention. A social worker noted that John showed signs of jealousy, feeling overshadowed by the care and focus his siblings received. During their interviews, both boys immediately began blaming each other. Initially, John refused to admit to even being at the shopping center that day. However, after 2 days of questioning, the investigators revealed that Robert had already told them John was there, causing John to shift his story. When police interviewed Robert, they struggled to determine how much he genuinely understood. Eventually, Robert admitted that both he and John had skipped school that Friday and gone to the Strand shopping center to walk around and shoplift. While there, they noticed James with his mother. Robert claimed that after seeing James, they left the shopping center and visited the library before heading home. During his interview, Robert insisted he hadn't left the shopping center with John and James, despite having earlier told investigators he spent the whole day with John. Video evidence contradicted his claims, showing John leading James by the hand while Robert walked ahead. Each time Robert was caught in a lie, he would break down in tears. Eventually, Robert admitted that John had held James' hand as they walked around, but claimed the pair had released a young boy by a nearby church. Both boys clearly struggled to grasp the seriousness of their actions. At one point, John even asked investigators if they were going to take James to the hospital to make him better. Robert consistently altered his story in an attempt to distance himself from the events. He later told investigators he left John and James near the railroad tracks after John had thrown paint into James' eyes, claiming that he had no idea what happened afterwards. However, his demeanor shifted when investigators asked if he had stolen batteries. His face turned bright red as he denied it, visibly distressed and panicked by the question. It was at this point that Robert accused John of going into a killing frenzy, alleging that John threw bricks, hit James with a stick, and threw batteries at him, all while Robert claimed he tried to intervene and stop John. When asked why John supposedly acted this way, Robert claimed he didn't know, but did confess to shoplifting the batteries. When pressed further, Robert emotionally cried and deflected, saying, "Well, that is what you think," each time investigators suggested he was involved in harming James. His mother sat by his side throughout the interviews. After investigators discovered James' body, a memorial was set up near the railway tracks. Robert brought a single rose to the site, and when questioned about his gesture, he said, "Because then baby James would know I try to help him, and that I'm thinking of him now." Robert also expressed fear of being haunted by James. On the third day of questioning, Robert admitted to touching James' body, explaining the blood found on his shirt. He claimed he had been trying to move James off the tracks, but stopped because there was so much blood. Robert also mentioned that he had a baby brother, saying that if he wanted to kill a baby, he could have harmed his own. However, he became most agitated when asked about the injuries to James' genitals. Defensive and emotional, Robert adamantly denied involvement, repeatedly saying he wasn't a pervert, and instead accused John of pulling down James' pants and touching him. Throughout most of the interview, Robert maintained his composure. However, John's demeanor during questioning was much more volatile. Known for being emotional and prone to outbursts, he was hysterical from the start. Unable to handle the questioning, John often became too distraught to speak. Unlike Robert, John didn't lie outright. He attempted to avoid answering questions or deflect the truth. With encouragement from his mother to be honest, John eventually began revealing unsettling details. He told investigators that Robert was a bad one and had orchestrated the entire incident. Faced with pressure, John finally lowered his head and admitted, "I did kill him." He then asked, "What about his mom? Will you tell his mom that I'm sorry?" John Venables and Robert Thompson were charged with the murder of James Bulger on the 20th of February, 1993. They became the youngest individuals in 250 years to be charged with murder in the UK. The trial of Robert Thompson and John Venables began on November 1st, 1993. At the time, the boys' names had not been released. Both boys, only 11 years old, sat in raised chairs in the dock, separated from their parents, though close enough to touch when their families attended the proceedings. They faced charges of murder, abduction, and attempted abduction, denying all counts brought against them. The charge of attempted abduction stemmed from an earlier incident. The boys allegedly tried to lead another 2-year-old child away from the New Strand shopping center, but were stopped just in time by the child's mother. A pivotal element of the trial was more than 20 hours of tape-recorded police interviews with the boys. These tapes became a critical component of the prosecution's case. At the core of the trial was the legal principle of dolly inca pax, which presumes that children under a certain age cannot be held legally responsible for their actions. The prosecution, led by Richard Enriques, argued successfully against this presumption, asserting that Robert and John demonstrated mischievous discretion, a clear awareness that the acts that they were engaging in were gravely wrong. Expert testimony from child psychiatrists bolstered the prosecution's argument. Dr. Eileen Vizard testified that, on the balance of probabilities, Robert understood the difference between right and wrong. Similarly, forensic psychiatrist Susan Bailey attested that John had a clear understanding of the seriousness of his actions. Details of what happened to 2-year-old James Bulger were uncovered during the trial, leaving the courtroom and the nation profoundly shocked. Over the course of their 2.5-mile walk with James, Robert and John encountered multiple witnesses. At one point, they entered a pet shop where they fixated on a dead fish and caused a commotion. The pet shop owner observed how tightly John held James' hand, refusing to release his grip. They continued walking and made it to County Road when they saw a woman walking her dog. They told her that he was a lost boy from the Strand and that they had found him. They told her they were on the way to the police station. The woman informed police that John had been taking control of the situation and holding the conversation. Robert let go of James' hand and seemed nervous. However, John told him to get a hold of his hand. Robert took James' hand again. Another woman came along with a young daughter. She asked James if he was all right, but he didn't respond. The women felt as though something wasn't right. She wasn't sure if the boys were being honest. Feeling uneasy, she asked the woman with her dog if she could watch her daughter for a bit while she took James to the police station. But the lady with the dog said no, my dog doesn't like kids. Unsure what else to do, she asked the boys if they knew the way. They said yes, pointing in the correct direction. Why could she not have taken both kids? As the three boys continued walking, they came across a candy store. In the store, the shopkeeper noticed that James had a significant cut and bruise to his head, but he too did nothing. Many witnesses had seen the boys on their walk. One recalled seeing Robert carrying James like a baby. Another had seen him holding John's hand. Both boys were clearly involved. Despite these many witnesses, not one intervened in time. If just one witness had intervened, James could have been alive today. The trial presented harrowing evidence, including physical exhibits such as a blood-stained stone, various bricks, James Bulger's underpants, and a railway fish plate believed to have been used in the attack. A pathologist detailed the horrifying extent of James' injuries, describing severe brain damage and numerous other wounds. The cruelty and calculated nature of the crime appalled both the court and the public. Throughout the trial, Robert Thompson maintained his composure. John Venables, however, visibly struggled. He experienced vivid flashbacks and exhibited signs of severe PTSD, at one point stripping off his clothes during the trial, claiming he could smell baby James on himself. On November 24, 1993, both boys were found guilty of James Bulger's murder. At just 11 years old, they became the youngest convicted murderers in the 20th century. Rather than a fixed sentence, they were sentenced to indefinite detention, to be held until authorities determined they could be rehabilitated. It was initially estimated they would serve at least 8 years, meaning they would remain in custody until after they had turned 18. The detention facilities they were sent to resembled modern rehabilitation centers rather than prisons, complete with private rooms, basketball courts, and swimming pools. This sparked outrage among the public, who argued that the boys should be placed in adult facilities instead. At the conclusion of the trial, reporting restrictions were lifted, and the boys' names were released to the public. This move faced significant scrutiny in the years that followed, as it sparked ongoing debates about the balance between public safety, transparency, and the rights of juvenile offenders. After undergoing extensive rehabilitation therapy, both boys were paroled in 2001. The conditions of their release were as follows. They were strictly prohibited from contacting each other or the family of James Bulger. They were banned from entering the Merseyside region. They could be subjected to curfews, and they were required to report to probation officers regularly. Any violation of these terms or behavior that pose a risk to public safety could result in their return to prison. Upon their release, they were given new identities to protect them. Authorities enforced strict measures to keep their identities confidential. So much so that when someone leaked a photo of John Venables, they faced jail time for the breach. The boys' families were also relocated with new identities to ensure their safety. Since his release, Robert Thompson has reportedly led a stable and law-abiding life. He is in a committed relationship, and court reports highlight that he has significantly changed from the boy he once was. Robert himself expressed in a letter that, as horrific as the crime was, it led to support and education that helped him transform into who he is today. John Venables, however, has had a troubling post-release record. He has been arrested twice for offenses involving child pornography and is currently in prison after his parole was denied in 2020. James Bulger's father has actively campaigned for John Venable's identity to be revealed, arguing that the deal granting both boys a fresh start should have been voided following John's reoffending. However, his appeal to expose John's identity has been denied, despite John's additional crimes involving children. The subsequent trial and release of Robert and John sparked intense debate and raised difficult questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the protection of identities. While options may differ on whether these boys should have been given a second chance or held accountable for their crime for life, one thing remains clear: the tragic events surrounding James Bulger's death will continue to be remembered and scrutinized for years to come. So, what do you think? Should the boys' identities have been protected? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button